has. So if you're one of our kiddos, feel free to go ahead and slip out to Children's Church to my left. Christy's over here, and I think she's going to be taking you guys off to Children's Church. If you're not familiar with that, if this is your first week with us, the way that we do Children's Church is we think it's important for children to be in church with their kids. And so for a lot of the older kids, they sing with us, they worship with us, and then when it's time to get into the Word, we send them to kind of a more intentional lesson that would be geared towards where they are. So, and then strategically throughout the year, we try to make sure the older kids are in church, and so we're going to do that next month sometime too. So, hey, if you have a Bible, open up with me to Ruth Chapter 3. Ruth Chapter 3, and we're going to try to cover this entire chapter today. So hopefully you're ready to read a lot and really dig into this really, really cool text. Okay, so before we do that, though, I want everybody in here, if you can, to pull out your phone. Can you guys pull out your phones right now? Remember, I can see if you don't do it because I can see all of you. So pull out your cell phone if you don't mind. Most of you probably already had your cell phone out because people don't normally have a Bible to church. Their Bible is their phone, and their phone is their Bible. So, and here's what I want you to do. I want you to open up like a note inside of your phone, somewhere where you can type something. And here's what I want you to type. If you are married, or if you're single, it doesn't matter. So if you're not married, it really is insignificant. What advice would you give to somebody that's not married in saying, these are the characteristics and attributes of what you should be looking for in the dating process? And I want you to put 2. And I want those 2 to be the top 2 things that are of value and of importance. And so don't mess it up. You only get 2, okay? So what are the top 2 things that if you could be sharing with somebody that's not yet married, based on your experience, based on what you think, of saying this is the most important thing that you could look for? I'll give you a second as you write that. So, all right. Long pauses and silences are uncomfortable for me in a room this size. So, hopefully you could fairly quickly at least write down one thing. Maybe you didn't get 2 things, but generally speaking, most of you guys should have been able to write 2 things pretty quick. So in preparation for this time in Ruth Chapter 3, I Googled that. I Googled, what are single people looking for in dating? And I discovered a massive research that was done in 2020 by a really good organization called Pew Research. And so here's what Pew Research said. There's tons of data. You can find it online. I've got the link here in my notes. If you want it, I can send it to you after the sermon. Here's one of the things that they discovered. So they surveyed thousands of singles. Many of them were not Christians. Some of them were Christians. It was a mixture of Christian, non-Christian. And here's the thing where you really got to figure out what single people are looking for. They said if you are like talking to somebody, so you're interacting with somebody in a relational way, either online or at work or somewhere, and you found this out about them, it would be a deal breaker. So if you're with them and you realize they do X, for a lot of single people, they would say, I would immediately end the relationship if I found out they do that. And then they ranked them as far as what's the most common answers amongst the single people that they surveyed. So here's some of the answers, okay? So number 1 on the list, 51% of singles say, if I find out the person that I'm talking to lives far away, it's not going to work out. Long-distance relationships are a no-go. And I'm like, what's up with that? Like, I had a long-distance relationship the entire time that I was, like, engaged in dating. But whatever, things have changed. 2, if the person that they're talking to has a significant amount of debt, so tens of thousands of dollars of debt, they would immediately end the relationship. And I'm like, that's a rough one, too, because most people, when they get married, got debt. Here's the third one. You ready? If they voted for Donald Trump. Yeah, so you could laugh at that because that's dumb. You know what I'm saying? And just so we're clear, if you go down to number 8 on the list was if they voted for Hillary Clinton. Anybody want to guess what number 9 on the list was? Religious beliefs. So ponder this with me. Single people in America, based on that data, care more about people's political affiliation than they do about life's biggest questions, such as, who created the world? How did we get here? What's my purpose for life? Is there a God, and how do I know them? And is Jesus the Son of God? Those questions are massively important and have eternal consequences if you get them wrong. And in America, people care more about what you think about Trump and Hillary. We care more about the people in politics than we do about the person of Christ. So I show you that data to say, I hope in your two things you did not put anything political. Do you know what I'm saying? And if you did, it's all good. We love you anyways, but there's more important things about what we're going to do when it comes to dating than political affiliations. And so our text today is this beautiful narrative of how God providentially is bringing two single people together. And the focus of the text is not necessarily about single people dating. The text is primarily about a providential God who is working things out to show that he's a God of redemption. That's been the focus of the entire book of Ruth. Everything is about displaying that God is in the business of saving people that need to be saved. And what we're going to read is the model that God uses to display his redemptive nature is by bringing two single people, Boaz and Ruth, together. And we get to read how this is going to happen. And Ruth 3 is kind of an interesting text. There's some strange things in it that we'll talk about in a second. And this entire chapter is divided into two sections. The first section is Naomi. Remember, that's this Ruth's mother-in-law. She's going to lay out a strategic plan to try and get Ruth and Boaz together. Then the second half of the chapter is going to focus in on how Ruth is going to implement that plan. And I'm not going to suggest, you'll see in the text, Ruth is going to change that plan a little bit. But if you weren't here last week or the week before, I want to briefly, just very quickly review what's been going on. Otherwise, you're going to be confused over what's happening. So in Ruth chapter 1, if you remember, Naomi and Ruth, their husbands die. Naomi's sons is one of Ruth's husbands, and they've been widowed. And in this culture and in this time, there was no college, there was no means of occupation for a lot of these ladies, and so they were destitute. They were stuck in poverty. But despite that, Ruth decides to not go back to the land of Moab and worship the pagan gods. She decides to put her faith in Yahweh and die wherever Naomi's going to die. And so there's this beautiful picture of Ruth displaying godly character and staying with her mother-in-law when a lot of people, actually her sister-in-law actually did go back to the land of Moab. But then when we look at chapter 2, Ruth meets Boaz, and Boaz is incredibly generous towards Ruth. He's good to her. She's picking grains in the field, and Boaz shows favor on her. And then Naomi, at the very end of the chapter last week, Naomi reveals that Boaz is from the family of redeemers. And we spent a little bit of time talking about kinsman redeemer, and we'll come back at the very end and really unpack what that word kinsman redeemer means again. So if you have a Bible, I want to look at chapter 3, verses 1 through 6. So let me read this to you, and we're going to just break it down. Verse 1. Then Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her, "My daughter, should I not seek rest for you, that it may be well with you? Is not Boaz our relative with those young women you were? See, he is winnowing barley tonight at the threshing floor. Wash therefore and anoint yourself, and put on your cloak, and go down to the threshing floor. But do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. But when he lies down, observe the place where he lies. Then go and uncover his feet and lie down, and he will tell you what to do." And she replied, "All that you say I will do." So let me just look at a few things that are really important inside of this section. The first thing is this. It seems like the place that the interaction is going to take between Boaz and Ruth is at something called the threshing floor. Now, I personally have never been to a threshing floor, so maybe we should explain what it is. The threshing floor was the location where the farmers of that time would take all of their grain, all of their wheat, and they would put it kind of in a giant circle. And they would have some sort of livestock. Almost always it would be an ox, and that ox would walk around in the circle, and he would thresh the actual grain itself. And what that would do was it would separate the food that they could eat from the garbage on that seed. And so what the farmer would do is after the ox would thresh the grain, he would take a pitchfork and he would throw it in the air, and the wind would blow away the bad stuff, and it would leave the good stuff for them to eat. And the reason this is an important point is because during that harvest time, that was incredibly, you and I can go to Walmart or Aldi and get whatever food we want at pretty much any given time of the day, but it wasn't that way back then. Food was incredibly valuable. And so during this threshing time, many times whoever owned the field would be in the threshing floor, in the room, protecting it because it had so much value. And from what I've read, it seems like from the interaction of Ruth working in the field in chapter 2 to the harvest time is somewhere between 6 to 8 weeks. So that means Ruth has faithfully worked like an employee for 6 to 8 weeks for Boaz inside of that field. And so then Naomi comes out and says, I've got a plan to work this out. Like, I'm going to hook you up, Ruth. Listen to my plan. And so here's some things that she says. She says, wash and anoint yourself and put on your very, very best. Now, it's kind of weird for us to say put oil on your skin, but back in this time, the fact that a woman's skin would be shiny was a reflection of her being attractive and beautiful. It was a common practice. It was almost like saying, hey, go put on some perfume and go put on some makeup. But remember, Ruth is poverty-stricken. She's poor. She's having to wake up and work in a field. She's essentially a refugee. And so she may not, I know for sure, she doesn't have this closet of going, I'm going to pick the dress that's going to turn heads. It's not that way. She is going and probably taking an old piece of garment and having to wash it really, really well in order that she can be presentable. But here's what Naomi is saying. Naomi is saying, make sure you look beautiful whenever you get there. The second thing Naomi says is don't approach him till after he has eaten and had a little wine to drink. Now, the language here is somewhat vague, and so we don't know exactly what it means. It could mean that just let him kind of relax for a minute, and then you can go lay down next to him. Or it could mean that if he's having a little bit of wine to drink, he's either going to be drunk at the end of it, or he's going to be somewhat buzzing, and he'll be a little more open to hearing whatever it is that you have to offer after that. Ruth. So we don't know which one it is, but we certainly know that the advice that Naomi gives is very specific of saying, wait till after he's drank and wait till after he's eaten and he's laying down. Then she says, uncover his feet and lie down next to him. We'll come back to that. Then she says, don't say a word, Ruth. When you get there, just lay down next to him. And when he sees you, Boaz will tell you what to do, but don't speak. So the question that you and I need to wrestle with very briefly is this. Is the advice that Naomi gives good or bad? Now, we can conclude that some of the advice is good advice, right? Like it's good that she's going to go and it's good that she wants to look pretty and all that kind of stuff. But the thing that people debate is over the whole idea of uncovering his feet. Now, I've read quite a bit this week just trying to figure out what was the best way of understanding it. And what I've realized is a lot of really smart people are divided on how you should understand the uncovering of the feet. So there's some people who say Naomi is giving really good advice. And the argument goes somewhat like this. It's saying she is following the scriptural parameters by in which a woman could have been redeemed by a family member, by like the kinsman redeemer principle. And so all that Naomi is doing is encouraging Ruth to go do the thing that God had already made provisions for her. And in this way of seeing it, it's like uncovering his feet is the idea that his feet would get cold, and then he would wake up, and because he would wake up, he would see Ruth there, and then a conversation would start, and then all of a sudden it would be like the most romantic comedy on Netflix that you've ever seen, right? It would just be this beautiful thing that has worked out. But there's another perspective that I think is pretty interesting. The other perspective is that language of saying uncover his feet is Naomi's way of trying to be manipulative and controlling for God's will. Now here's where that comes from. That phrasing in the Hebrew of uncovering somebody's feet is an idiom. It's another way of saying of revealing his private parts. And so there's some Hebrew scholars that say that what Naomi is actually telling Ruth to do is to go in there and sexually seduce Boaz. And then they say, well, and that would make sense because remember the background of Ruth. Ruth is from the land of Moab. This is what women from Moab were known for. Like if you want something, the women from Moab, what you do is you leverage your body and you leverage sex to get the thing that you want. And so some scholars would say that Naomi is just tapping into the past of Ruth to manipulate and to get the thing that she needs, which is to not be in poverty anymore. Now here's the truth. We don't know exactly which one it is. And I read some people that are way smarter than me and that have studied it way more than I have studied it. And what I've realized is really, really great people agree to disagree on which one it is. One commentary I read said it like this: both interpretation of Naomi's speech are plausible. They're a possibility. But either way, they both heighten our suspense. And so what this guy says is, he says it could be either way, but the point is Ruth needs to be redeemed. And the place that she's going to find redemption is through that kinsman redeemer. And so we're looking forward to how that's going to be set up. And I think here's the bigger point from this section, is you need to realize Ruth is taking a massive risk by approaching Boaz. So regardless of the motivation of Naomi or the counsel that she's giving, here's what we know. What she's doing is a big deal, what Ruth is doing. It's huge. She's going to approach a man at night and lay down next to him. Even if it's not sexual in nature, it can be that way if he perceives it that way. And then she's going to essentially propose to him. She's going to say, "Will you put a ring on it, my friend Boaz?" You know what I mean? That's a bold move for a lady. And we kind of live in a feministic America where it's kind of like in America, it's like women are like, "I'm going to pay for the bill." You got to realize that's a foreign concept in this context, okay? Women weren't that bold back then. Women weren't expected to propose to men. Women were expected to be proposed to. And in a real way, she was, to a degree, supposed to wait for Boaz to initiate that kind of relationship. But she's stepping out in faith, and she's initiating it herself. So which means there's the risk that she could be rejected. Which, by the way, is a horrible feeling to be rejected if you've ever been rejected. I've been rejected a couple of times in my life, and it's a really awkward thing when you say, "Hey, I want to hang out," and they're like, "Yeah, I don't want that," you know? And she's also running the risk of her reputation being tarnished. Right now, she is this God-fearing worshiper of Yahweh that has left paganism to provide and take care of her mother-in-law. And if she's not careful, her reputation is going to be somewhat of a harlot for laying next to Boaz. She has a lot to lose. But despite those risks, she's still stepping out in faith, and she's going to approach Boaz in this way. So let me just make a really, really quick point, y'all. I think taking a risk as a Christian should be a regular part of the Christian life. Risk means that you willingly make a decision that exposes you to something that is uncomfortable or dangerous. And even if this may not be the most home run example of taking a risk, you need to know the Bible is filled with the people of God taking risk for the glory of God all over the place. So here's just a couple. When Moses meets the burning bush, meets the Lord at the burning bush, the Lord tells him, "I want you to go back into Egypt, and I want you to meet the most influential, powerful person on the planet, who is Pharaoh, and just go tell him to let my people go," which that would have been in the millions of people. And Moses is like, "Okay, wait a second. Are you sure you want me to do that? And who am I going to say sent me? And I've got a stutter." And he's got all these reasons why it's not logical to take such a massive risk. And guess what God says? God says, "I'm going to be with you. And when you get there, you just tell them that I am sent you, that Yahweh has sent you, and I'll take care of everything." And guess what? God said his people go. Let his people go. Then you have David and Goliath. I mean, I'm cherry picking these. They're all over the place. You got David and Goliath. Goliath is standing in the valley, cursing Yahweh, and all the people of God are cowering in fear. They're afraid, and they're scaredy cats. And David shows up, and David's like, "I'm not going to be afraid of him. I serve the God of the Most High. I'm willing to go to battle against him." And he takes a risk, and God honors that. Then you have Stephen in Acts chapter 6. Stephen preaches a sermon, and at the end of that sermon, they stone him to death. If you look at Paul's third missionary journey from Acts chapter 16 all the way to the end of the book, over and over and over again, Paul is putting himself in places that he is not safe and that he is taking massive risk, and he's doing it for God's glory. So here's my question, Christian. What are you willing to risk for God's glory? Does your fear stop you from doing whatever it is, the thing that God has told you to do? Does your love for comfort and security prevent you from obeying God? And if I could just give some very specific examples, at least for my own life, that I struggle with this. So if you're looking for a specific way that sometimes we're crippled by our fear and we don't take risk, here's one: sharing our faith with people who need it. We call that evangelism in the church. Proclaiming the good news to people who don't have the good news. You need to know when you do it, there's risk involved. Agreed? There's the risk that you could say, here's what I hear from people. I could say something that's wrong and push people away. What if they ask me a question and I don't know how to answer that question and I look stupid? What if they label me as some sort of religious zealot and at the workplace they think I'm strange? There's risk involved, but so what? Those people will not believe the gospel unless we tell them the gospel. The second way that I see it sometimes, people don't like taking risk with their money. What are you not being generous about because you're worried about what could happen? We want to be the kind of people that with our money and our resources, we're willing to give our money back to God in some way, shape, or form and risk it for His glory. Y'all, this is why taking risk should be a part of our lives. Because when you take risk, you are keenly aware that the only way this is going to work out is God's on your side. And when you take risk, you do it in such a way that you're saying, God, I'm dependent on you. Just for a reference point, this whole church thing that we're doing, this whole church plant is a risk. But it's all for God's glory. And God's honored that so far. And one day we might have a building, and it's going to be a beautiful thing long term. But right now, we're rocking and rolling, taking risk where we are. Does that make sense? So I want to look at the next section. So look down at verse 6. So here's what happens. So I'm going to read all the way down through verse 12. So she went down to the threshing floor and did just as her mother-in-law had commanded her. And when Boaz had eaten and drunk, and his heart was merry, he went to lie down at the end of the heap of grain. Then she came softly and uncovered his feet and lay down. And at midnight the man was startled and turned over, and behold, a woman lay at his feet. And he said, Who are you? And she answered, I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your wings over your servant, for you are a redeemer. And he said, May you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter. You have made this last kindness greater than the first, in that you have not gone after younger men, whether poor or rich. And now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you all that you ask, for all my fellow townsmen know that you are a worthy woman. And now it is true that I am a redeemer. Yet there is a redeemer nearer than I, and remain tonight, and in the morning, if he will redeem you, good. If he will redeem you, good. Let him do it. But if he is not willing to redeem you, then the Lord lives, and I will redeem you. Lie down until the morning. So I just want to work through just a couple of things. So Ruth goes and she implements at least a portion of Naomi's plan. So she cleans herself up. She puts oil on her skin. She's looking beautiful. She lies down next to him, and she uncovers his feet, whatever that phrase particular means. And when Boaz sees Ruth lying next to him, he's shocked, and he's somewhat confused. And this is where Ruth takes a different path from what Naomi said. Because what Naomi told her to do is just be quiet, just be silent, and he will direct you. He will tell you what to do. But that's not what Ruth does. Ruth speaks up, and Ruth says, I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your wings over your servant, for you are one of my redeemers. And what Ruth is saying in that is two very simple things. She's stating a fact. She is saying, Boaz, you are from the tribe, you are from the family that has the ability to redeem me. That you have the power and the influence to provide for my mother-in-law and myself. You have those resources to give us hope and to help us in our time of need. You're one of our redeemers. And the other thing that she's doing is she's making a massively bold request. She's saying, Boaz, would you redeem me? Will you marry me? Will you take care of me and provide for my mother-in-law and I? Here's what's interesting, y'all. When I got engaged to Audrey, I knew that she was going to say yes. And that's not arrogance. I did. We had dated for a while. I knew she was going to say yes. And I was still really nervous before I proposed to her. Because I'm just like, this is a big deal. I just kept thinking, don't mess this up, you know? And I knew she was going to say yes. And I still had to kind of muster up some courage to make that request to my wife. And so I just imagine that Ruth had to muster up the same thing. And she basically is like, I think Ruth is saying there's nothing sexual about this. It's relational. We need your help. And the Bible makes these parameters in order for you to help us. And notice what Boaz says back. The first thing Boaz says back is, may you be blessed by the Lord. It's spiritual. It's worshipful. He's immediately impressed by the character that Ruth displays. He says, you could have pursued younger men. You could have pursued something that a lot of women would have considered to be more important, like how much money they have. But you don't do either of those things. That you pursued a redeemer, not for shallow reasons, like age or money, but you pursued what you believed God said was best for you. And get this, that's attractive to Boaz. That's beautiful to him in the life of Ruth. And so then he says, I want to redeem you. He says, let's do it. But there's a problem. In the lifeline of that family, there's somebody that would take priority over Boaz. And what Boaz says is we've got to follow the way God's designed it, and they get first dibs. And so what we're going to study next week is we're going to study how God works it out even despite that detail. But what Boaz is saying, I want to care for you. I want to marry you. And we're not going to read it just for the sake of time, but when you look at verses 13 through 18, if I could just summarize it. So Boaz tells Ruth, why don't you just stay the night? But in the morning, hurry up and leave. It seems like he's saying that because he doesn't want rumors to be spreading. He doesn't want people to be saying critical things about Ruth. But then he goes on and he gives Ruth 6 measures of barley. But in modern day terms, that was around 70 pounds of grain. And Boaz does this simply because he loves Ruth. And he wants to provide for Ruth and Naomi. He specifically says, take this back to your mother-in-law. And get this, Ruth is so strong, she carries 70 pounds on her back to wherever it is her mother-in-law was. Like, I'm going to be real. I feel like I could lift a little bit of weight. That's a lot of weight to throw on your back and walk a really, really long way, which just displays how strong she was. And then Ruth gets back and she explains the story to Naomi, and Naomi shares some of her thoughts. But regardless of those details, you can see this picture that, once again, Boaz is attracted to Ruth because of her godly character, and Ruth is attracted to Boaz because of his just generous, godly life. Now, if you are here and you are not currently married, you guys have heard me say this before, singleness can be somewhat of a complex topic because there's so many scenarios and contexts in which people find themselves to be single. Track with me? So there's older singles, there's younger singles, and then you can define that in all million different ways. Then there's people who have kids, people who don't have kids. There's people who have kids that are adults and people who have kids that are babies still. And then there's some singles that have kids across the spectrum. There's people that have been divorced and not divorced, people that have never been married. There's just 1,000,001 scenarios, okay? So I just want to speak very clearly to the single people who are interested in dating. I think that there's some rich truths here for your heart as we work through this, okay? So I want you to notice what brings Ruth and Boaz together. It's 2 things. 1, it is a providential God. We'll come back to that at the end because I think that's really the main focus. But the way that a providential God is bringing them together is through an attraction between the 2 of them. And so God's providential plan is being worked out in the details through this relationship between Ruth and Boaz. And so my experience over the years of interacting with a lot of people who aren't married and they're interested in dating is they generally, so this is a general statement, and this is my opinion, this isn't from the text, okay? So like generally speaking, a lot of people that I interact with when it comes to dating, they prioritize things and make them higher of importance than they probably should. And so in my lifetime in the church, that normally means that people are infatuated with some sort of romantic feeling of love in the dating process. So normally that's, I kind of jokingly say it's like a rom-com from like TV or something, you know. It's just like when the guy walks in the room, and ladies, I'm not throwing shade, but almost always it's the ladies, and it's like when the guy comes in the room, I just want to feel this butterfly feeling in my stomach when they're here. And they want this romantic, romance, Prince Charming, sweep you off your feet kind of thing. And that's not necessarily bad, but you got to realize, like, I've been married for 12 years. There are some days, I promise you, I walk in the room, Audrey don't get butterflies in her stomach, okay? She might be frustrated with me some days. So sometimes that can't be like the most important thing. But the other side of the coin is a lot of times there's single people who say the most important thing is physical attraction. Like, that's supreme. Nothing else matters besides there being a physical attraction between the 2 of them. And what I want you to notice from Ruth and Boaz, like the way that God is working out this marriage, is that what's interesting them in one another is not some fancy pie-in-the-sky romantic feeling in their belly. And it's not some sort of physical attraction. It's the godly character of each of them. And I stumbled across this reality as I was working through this text. So your English version of the Bible, the order of the books is very specific. But that's been changed over time. And in the Hebrew Bible, the original collection of the Old Testament books, and I'm not saying it's better, it's just different, the book of Ruth is placed differently. In our English Bibles, it's after Judges, because that's the time frame and the historical narrative when it took place. But in the Hebrew Bible, it's directly after the book of Proverbs. And there seems to be this connection between the end of the book of Proverbs and the book of Ruth because they ordered it that way. So if you guys are familiar with this, chapter 31 of the book of Proverbs is traditionally known as a Proverbs 31 kind of woman. There's ministries that have that name. And what Proverbs 31 is focused on, it's a godly mother trying to tell her son the kind of woman that he should be pursuing. So if you're going to be pursuing a woman, this is what you should be looking for. And there's all kinds of characteristics and attributes that that mother is giving godly wisdom to her husband or to her son to try to figure out. I just want to read kind of the very end of Proverbs 31. Here's what it says. It's verse 30. It says, "Charm is deceptive and beauty is fleeting, but a woman who fears the Lord is to be praised. Honor her for all that her hands have done, and let her works bring her praise at the city gate." And if you notice, throughout the book of Ruth, there's this praise of Ruth, that they praise her at the gate. That's where many of the leaders of that city would have dwelled, and so they're praising her and saying how great she is. And what the proverbial wisdom is saying is, it's saying, be careful how much importance you place on physical beauty and how charming they are, because those things are going to fade away. And what will last for a lifetime of relationship is the character of the person, way more important than the physical appearance. And the Lord put these two together, I think, at least in the Hebrew, to say that, or at least whoever put those orders together, chapter 31 of Proverbs is pointing us to the person of Ruth, because Ruth is a Proverbs 31 kind of woman. Here's the way one commentator said it. The commitment that Ruth and Boaz had to one another was built on their common character, which is always a much better foundation for a lasting relationship than mere physical attraction. Theirs was a character match, not a love match. They were both people of substance. So if we could just directly apply this to kind of two demographics in our church. So the first one is if you're here and you're a teenager, you're a student, and you're considering dating or you're pursuing dating in some way, shape, or form, I would just ask, what things are you looking for in the person that you're trying to date? And let me suggest to you, if you're here and you're a student, that the most important thing that you should be looking for is if they share your love for Jesus. And if they do not share your love for Jesus, then you have no business being in a relationship with them. None. Because that kind of dating relationship, it will not last long term, generally speaking. Because you don't agree on the main thing. And you're not married yet, teenagers. And you date to marry. So right now, as a student, you have the opportunity to make a decision that could alter the trajectory of your life. And if you're with somebody right now, even as a young, like 15, 16, 17-year-old, and they don't follow Jesus the way that you do, that means their path is going that direction. And if you love Jesus, your life is going that direction. And you could prevent the heartache down the road by just not being together right now and only dating people that agree with you on the most important thing on the planet, which is who is Jesus. Does that make sense? And what I mean by that is that we live in Palatka. Let me kind of clarify for Palatka. So in Palatka, you could ask anybody, are you a Christian? Not anybody. 90% of the people will stand up and go, oh yeah, I'm a Christian. So I don't even mean they check the box of Christian. I mean they love Jesus. And there's evidence in their life that they actually are committed to Christ. But everybody else here, if you're not currently married, I think an implication of this text is to just say be careful how much value you put on romantic love and physical attraction. Hear me. Those things are important, okay? They're valuable. Can I prove it? Nobody in this room wants to be married or dating somebody that you're not attracted to. Nor do you want to be the person in the relationship where they look at you and they're not attracted to you. Does that make sense? You want to be with somebody that says looks don't matter, because you're like, well, what's that mean? You know what I'm saying? Like nobody wants to be in that kind of relationship. So it matters. I'm just saying to you, it does not matter as much as they love Jesus. If you're ranking them, it's somewhere below their love and affections for Christ. So let me give you an example out of my own life that I think communicates this. So our first daughter, Olivia, when we had her, she was a really, really rough baby. What I mean by rough is she just didn't sleep through the night. And she did not sleep through a night for 18 months. So that means for a year and a half, Audrey and I would only sleep between 3 to 4 hours at a time, sometimes less than that. And the best part about that was everybody was experts on what we should do. So like, hey, here's what you should do, let her cry it out. So we would do that for like a month. Didn't work. Then people would be like, you got to coddle them. Then it was just like, oh, get some spray stuff in the air. It was like we would do anything, and we were so desperate. And that baby just did not want to sleep. And here's my question. After a year of sleeping 2 or 3 hours at a time, what if I would have gone to Audrey and said, look, Audrey, I could wake up early and watch our daughter and let you sleep in a little bit, but I'm not able to because the dad bod is getting a little out of control, and I got to get to the weight room. Now, let me ask you a question. In that moment, what do you think my wife cared more about? My dad bod or me helping her with our daughter who was up all night? She wanted more for a husband who was willing to sacrifice for her and to stay up with the baby. You know what was more attractive to Audrey during that time? Me helping with the dishes and taking out the trash. You think I would have woken up in the middle of the night with Audrey and go, I can't believe you don't have makeup on again. Or, oh my gosh, you're wearing the pajamas you wore yesterday. Do you think I would have said that to my wife? Do you think that would have been valuable to me during that season and that time? And it's no. It was not that valuable at all. You know what I wanted a wife who was willing to sacrifice sleep so that she would love our daughter well. That's what I wanted. And I got that by God's grace. And here's my point. When you're married, right, and you're with each other on some of the hardest, most difficult days of your life, you don't look at them and go, I'm so glad your eyes are green. You don't go, ladies, praise the Lord, you're taller than 6 foot tall and you make over $100,000 a year. You don't. And if you do, you're too immature. I love you, but wait a little bit before you put a ring on it. You know what I'm saying? Like the principle is, those things are important. And hear me, physical fitness is important. I'm not diminishing like the value of attraction and physical fitness. I'm just saying that it's not more important than godly character. That when you as a married couple agree on Jesus, that keeps you together for a long period of time. Does that make sense? And if you're single right now, you have the opportunity to make a godly decision to set your marriage on this path of growth for the rest of your life. And I just don't want that to be compromised because we care more about things than we probably should. But I want to be careful here because I don't necessarily think the text is about dating. I think that's the beautiful picture that God is laying forth in the text. But the text is ultimately displaying how God is bringing these two people together to display that He's a God of redemption. So James and them are going to come up, and I just want to kind of close out with this last thought that I think is beautiful. So last week I shared with you guys how kinsman redeemer is generally a reference to the provisions that God made within His law to take care of widows. That if a wife's husband died, that her brother would marry her in order to redeem her, in order that she wouldn't be stuck in poverty, and the family name could continue on for generations. But here's another way that in the Old Testament law they would have understood kinsman redeemer. It also would have been applied that if you had a family member, right, that had gotten into debt, they had borrowed money to the place that they could no longer pay it off. And the only single way that they could pay off their debt was in order for them to be sold as a slave and to work their debt off. That the other idea behind kinsman redeemer is that family member that has built a debt that they cannot pay off and who is currently a slave, if they do that, right, then the obligation of the kinsman redeemer is to come meet that family member wherever they are, pay off their debt, and redeem them and purchase them back into rightness with God. So the whole principle here is that the text is about these single people that God is bringing together in His providence. But that relationship between Boaz and Ruth is ultimately this picture of God's ability to redeem people that need redemption. Y'all, in my time with the Lord this week, I'm reading through the book of Galatians, and here's what Galatians 4:4 says. It says, when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth His Son, born of a woman, born under the law. And there's this picture in Galatians that when you and I say we're going to follow the rules and earn our way into heaven, Galatians says that means that you're condemned. It means you're cursed. But the good news of the gospel is that Christ loves you even though you're cursed. And even though you've accumulated a debt that you can never pay off, that Christ was hung to a tree and he was cursed on your behalf. And so the good news of this story is it is this picture of how God's bringing Ruth and Boaz together. But that narrative about these single people getting married is a picture to point us that God's in the business of saving people that need to be saved. And so the whole point of Ruth isn't about dating or what you should look for. The whole point is to see that it's about Christ and his glory and his ability to redeem and to save us. Ephesians 1:7 says it like this: in him we have redemption through his blood, the forgiveness of our trespasses according to the riches of his grace. Y'all, Christ has provided for you and I what we could never provide for ourselves, which is forgiveness of sins. And he's done that through his death and his resurrection, which is why we're able to sing that old hymn, that what can wash away my sin? Nothing but the blood of Jesus. And what can make me whole again? Nothing but the blood of Jesus. Because oh, precious is the flow that makes me white as snow. There's no other fount I know, nothing but the blood of Jesus. So I just want to say a quick word to this, okay? If you are here and you're not a Christian, I would invite you to trust Christ today. Being a Christian isn't being at church. Being a Christian isn't being religious. Being a Christian means that you believe that you have a problem that you cannot fix yourself, and the only way that you can resolve this problem of sin is to put your faith in God's Son, Jesus Christ. That's what Christianity is all about. And if you've believed in any other thing that's told you you're a Christian that's not Christ and his death and his resurrection, then I would say today you need to trust Christ. But maybe you're here today and you are a Christian, right? And you say, Daniel, I've got people in my life that need this gospel. Then I would say let's pray for them to come to faith in Christ. Let's pray that you would be so bold that you could go tell them about Jesus. That you could model the goodness and the beauty of Christ in the places that you live. So I want to pray for all of us in this room right now, believers and unbelievers, and we're going to have a time to sing this song and reflect on these truths. I'll be available. I'll be standing over here if you want somebody to pray for you or pray for a loved one that needs Christ. Eddie will be over here to my right, to your left. He'll be available to pray for you and intercede for you in any way that we're needing to. And maybe you say, I want to trust Jesus, and you want to come talk to a pastor. We are here to minister to you during this time. So, Father God, we love you. We're grateful for you. And you are the main thing. And so I pray, God, that in these coming moments, that you would help us to keep our eyes on you. And so people here that may not know you, Lord, would you reveal to them their great need for have a relationship with you, God. And I pray, Lord, for the people here that are Christians, people here that we may have children or spouses or parents who do not know you in this way that we described. I pray, God, that you would give us the boldness and the wisdom to proclaim this gospel to those family members and those loved ones. So I pray all of these in your name. Amen.